This presentation provides a brief history of activity on the Columbia River in British Columbia in the 1860s. My name is Ada Robinson. I started researching the early colonial history of the West Kootenay to provide background for a historical fiction novel which I am in the process of writing. I quickly discovered three things. First, that very little appears to have been written about that place and time in any collected or well-referenced way. Second, that sources contemporary with the events, such as diaries, letters, and newspaper articles, are really interesting. And third, that the local history I thought I knew was largely wrong. I have thoroughly enjoyed my re-education, and I'm pleased to be sharing some of what I have learned. I grew up in Trail on the Columbia River, where the red circle is on the map. The southeastern corner of our province is out of the way of major travel routes and is frequently overlooked by residents of other parts of the province. In history, too, the area now known as the West Kootenay tends to be overlooked, especially in accounts of times prior to the 1880s. I learned by osmosis, growing up in the area, that paddle wheel steamers operated on the lakes and rivers of the Kootenays from the 1880s to the 1950s. But it turns out the first steamer in that area began operating much earlier than I'd thought, in 1865. Reading the travelogue of a woman who took a trip on that steamer was the spark that ignited this whole project of mine. The sternwheeler 49 ran on the Columbia River between a point a few miles north of the present-day town of Colville, Washington, to another point upstream of what is now Revelstoke, BC. It operated regularly for only a few years in the late 1860s. Its mark on the territory was not deep enough or lasting enough to create a historical presence. However, it operated during a period when this region seemed to be on the verge of development and settlement, and the story of the 49 provides a focus for a look at the broader history of that time and place. This map covers the area of the West Kootenay plus some. I've deliberately left political boundaries and names off it for now. The prominent geographical features of this region are undoubtedly the mountain ranges, rivers, and lakes. The mountains are wild barriers which even today are crossed by few roads. Until railroads began penetrating the area in the mid-1880s, the easiest routes for travel were the lakes and rivers. The longest river on this map is the Columbia, which stands out as a major north-south corridor. For your orientation, here are the locations of the present-day towns of Revelstoke, Nelson, Trail, and Colville, Washington. None of these towns existed in the 1860s, although the Colville area had a significant settler population by that time, as well as an important Hudson's Bay Company post and a not-so-important U.S. Army post. Incidentally, both of those posts were called Fort Colville, to the confusion of later researchers like me. Humans first came to this area thousands of years ago. Archaeological evidence of village sites dating from 6,000 years ago exists in many places in the West Kootenay. 250 years ago, prior to European contact, the Sinixt people lived a hunter-fisher-gatherer lifestyle here. Their territory centered on the Arrow Lakes and Slocan Lake, which is between the Arrow Lakes and Kootenay Lake. Their territory stretched from around what is now Revelstoke to near what is now Colville. They were of the interior Salish culture, most closely related to the people of the Shuswap area to the west and the Colville area to the south. In the days before the Grand Coulee Dam was built, ocean salmon ran all the way through this territory and were an important food source. The primary means of transport for the Sinixt was the canoe, of the type called sturgeon-nosed. David Thompson traveled this stretch of the Columbia from south to north in 1811 to assess its value as a route for taking furs east to Montreal. While the route became used by the Northwest Company and later the Hudson's Bay Company for express journeys, it was not used for transporting furs. The canyons and rapids in the stretch north of the Arrow Lakes and the steep trek over the Rocky Mountains from the northern bend of the Columbia made the route impractical for heavy loads. In 1856, the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Shepherd on the Columbia River just south of the present town of Trail, but this area was never of great value to the company. In 1858, the colony of British Columbia was created. By the time period I am focusing on, namely the mid-1860s, epidemics of smallpox, measles, and influenza had reduced the population of Sinixt from probably more than 1,000 to perhaps 400. Groups still traveled seasonal rounds from one food source to another and wintered in villages close to Fort Shepherd, at the mouth of the Kootenay River near present-day Castlegar, and in other locations. They were a presence that outweighed the population of non-Indigenous in the area, and they were hired to provide canoe transport and to act as trail guides. The West Kootenay has little land suitable for farming or ranching. What first brought significant numbers of non-Indigenous people to this area was gold. The California gold rush, starting in 1848, was a training ground for men who prospected their way north during the 1850s after the California rush subsided. Similarly, when the Fraser River rush of 1858 and 59 tapered off, prospectors worked their way east across the mountains. Several small or short-lived rushes made people of the time aware of the southeast corner of British Columbia. One, generally known as the Colville Rush, started in about 1855 on the Columbia River near Colville and extended up the Pend d'Oreille River, which empties into the Columbia opposite the site of Fort Shepherd. In 1860, Rock Creek to the west boomed briefly. Wild Horse Creek in the East Kootenay became the hot spot in 1864. When such rushes faded, the diggings were rarely completely abandoned. Prospecting continued, and men, especially Chinese men, reworked old diggings for pennies in the pan, like gleaners in a field after a grain harvest. But such small operations didn't attract attention. In 1865, as the Wild Horse Creek rush tapered off, the Columbia River's Big Bend area became interesting. Incidentally, the spelling here of Colville with one L is not a typo. This is the way the Hudson's Bay Company spelled the name of their post, which was named after one of the company directors. At a later time, the small nearby river and the U.S. Army post took on the better-known 2L spelling. A letter from the Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Colville in March of 1865 says, "I found at this place about 50 miners preparing to start up the Columbia River the coming week." In May, the Daily British Colonist stated, "Great numbers of people are making their way up the Columbia toward Big Bend in boats and canoes." This is one type of boat used on the Columbia River throughout the 1800s. Originally built at Hudson's Bay Company posts such as Fort Colville, they were called bateaux and could be paddled, rowed, or sailed, depending on conditions. As usual, accounts are almost silent about the reaction of the indigenous Sinixt to this influx of foreigners. Apparently, from time to time, they tried to prevent miners from passing through their territory. The magistrate at Osoyoos wrote to the colonial secretary in August 1865, "I was informed that some Chinese bound for the upper Columbia had been stopped by Indians living near the mouth of Kootenay River, and given to understand that they, the Indians, would not allow them to proceed farther upriver for any purpose. I have since spoken to the Indian chief of these parts, and informed him that he, or any of his tribe, must not on any pretense whatsoever prevent travel through the country. Such indigenous actions had no effect on the incoming tide. The traffic on the river created a market that no doubt many business people eyed with calculation. However, it took an individual champion to take the big step of putting a steamboat on the route up the Columbia. The champion of the 49 was its captain and part owner, Leonard White. White was born in Kentucky or Indiana and came with his parents to Oregon Territory in 1843 at the age of 16. He accumulated a remarkable record of steamboating firsts. In 1848, he went to California and piloted the first steamboat on the Sacramento River. A few years later, he was back in Oregon. The heavy red lines on this map indicate stretches of river that White pioneered. On the Willamette River south of Portland, he was first to take a steamer to one point after another higher up the river, reaching Eugene in 1856. 2 years later, he was first to navigate a steamer on the Columbia River above the Dalles, Oregon. 3 years after that, he was first to take a steamer up the Snake River to present-day Lewiston. In subsequent years, he was first to go higher up the Snake and Clearwater rivers. Toward the end of those years, he was working as an employee of the Oregon Steam Navigation Company, or OSN. His salary was $500 per month, as compared to $300 for the other captains. When the OSN reduced his salary to put it in line with the other captains, White resigned. I wonder if he had another reason for resigning. Perhaps it was because he had his sights on one more challenge, the upper Columbia River. In 1865, he explored the Columbia by canoe, while his new steamer was under construction. His separation from the OSN seems to have been amicable, since that company was also a part owner of the 49 and provided the engines out of an older sternwheeler. There are no known photographs of the 49, but she was a sternwheeler like this boat, whose name I don't know. She was somewhat bigger than this and most likely a little more elaborate than this, but probably still very basic in style. While steamers with side wheels or screw propellers were useful on oceans and wide, deep rivers, sternwheelers were more maneuverable and less vulnerable to damage in narrow or shallow passages. This made them the ideal design for the rivers of the Pacific Northwest. Sternwheelers were flat-bottomed, and their rudders, 4 of them in a row, were tucked into the triangle of space between the rising rear part of the hull and the wheel. They drew very little water. One was reported as drawing only 1.5 feet, fully loaded. The 49 was built a couple of miles upstream of the Hudson Bay Company's Fort Colville. In December 1865, the Daily British Colonist reprinted an item from the Oregonian newspaper announcing the launch. A private letter informs us that at about 2:00 p.m. on Saturday, the 18th day of November, all things being in readiness, the new steamboat of Captain Len White, away up in the wilderness near the 49th parallel of latitude, glided safely down the ways and sits tranquilly on the bosom of the Columbia. It was an event calculated to inspire the hearts of the few people there with the hope of a glorious future, and we are not surprised to hear that the woods and the hills and the majestic cliffs re-echoed the sound of tumultuous voices as that pendant was unfurled by a passing breeze and revealed the name 49, which the pioneer craft will carry in honor of the latitude in which she was built. The Walla Walla Statesman newspaper gave a slightly different view of the event, also in the flowery prose style of the time. By the light of some candles and fitful glimpses of the polar star, the steamer 49, built by Messrs. White and Briggs, was launched at the old Hawkins Barracks, the winter quarters of the Boundary Commissioner, on the evening of the 18th of November, 1865, in the presence of a large crowd of the citizens and military of Colville Valley. As she slid into the Columbia on her port broadside, there was a strong northwest gale upon her bows and on the heads of her spectators. Yet those transplanted mountaineers and spectators gave the brave little vessel 3 hearty cheers, which, borne by the passing breeze, struck the Colville Hills with the sound of a fact that never happened before, nor shall happen again. There she lay afloat, and nearer the source of the Columbia by 400 miles than any craft propelled by steam ever was. Given the 114-foot length of the 49 and her registered tonnage, she may have had some enclosed space on the second deck. If so, these cabins were only for the boat's officers. Newspaper articles indicate that all the passengers camped ashore. She was reported to have a hurricane deck, which is to say that the top deck was roofed or partly roofed, although still open at the sides. The investors in the 49 aimed to cash in on one of the supply routes into the Big Bend. This route started from Walla Walla in southeastern Washington Territory. That town was in a good farming area, and by the 1860s had become a bustling supply center for mining towns to the east and north, including Wild Horse Creek in the East Kootenay. In 1866, a wagon road already existed from Walla Walla to the Colville Valley, and it was only a short distance north of there to the 49's base of operations. The other route was from Victoria or New Westminster via the Fraser and Thompson River valleys to Kamloops, then by steamer to the northeast corner of Shuswap Lake, then by a trail east over the mountains to the Columbia River. Newspapers in BC, Vancouver Island, Washington, and Oregon provided information and opinions about the 2 routes. Captain White is quoted as saying that the one possible objection against people rushing to Big Bend on his steamer is that the diggings were in British territory. For of course, the competition between these routes wasn't purely commercial. There was also the political angle, the promotion of British versus American interests. This artificial line, the 49th parallel, had been established 20 years earlier as the boundary between British and American territory from the Pacific coast to the plains. For many years after the establishment of the boundary, there were no colonial customs posts on the border in the interior. The line itself was not surveyed and marked until 1858 through 1861. Gold rushes, most notably that of the Caribou, brought increasing numbers of miners into the interior. To supply them, merchants in Victoria and New Westminster used difficult routes across the coast and interior mountain ranges, while American merchants used easy routes up the valleys of the Okanagan, Columbia, and Upper Kootenay rivers. The British merchants wanted the colonial government to build wagon roads into the interior. The Caribou Road became an important link to the northern interior, but for the Kootenays, the trail building that was done by Edgar Dewdney in 1865 was too little and too late to be a factor in the development of the area. The second thing British merchants wanted was the presence of customs officials on the border to enforce the collection of duties on goods brought in from the U.S. In addition to supporting business, the colonial government was keen to establish and maintain British law and order in the face of the influx of miners, who were largely American. Starting in 1860, customs posts were established near various interior border crossings as traffic warranted. The first was at Osoyoos, where traffic to both Kamloops and Rock Creek could be monitored. The men manning these border posts were expected to represent the government in many ways. A single man could potentially be customs officer, police constable, magistrate, and postmaster all at once. On the Columbia River, a full-time customs presence was established in the spring of 1865, when the Big Bend gold rush started drawing miners. The constable posted there in May was John Jane, an ex-Royal Engineers surveyor who had worked with the British Boundary Commission surveying the 49th parallel. He was housed in a rented outbuilding at Fort Shepherd, which was conveniently located just north of the boundary. The following year, when the steamer 49 started regular trips on the river, this location was not as convenient. In May, John Jane wrote to the colonial secretary, "We are seriously troubled for the want of office accommodation. The steamer landing is about a mile from the fort, and we have there on steamer days to occupy a portion of an unfinished building, for which I fear we shall have to pay a rental. The government office at the fort is in an outhouse formerly occupied by Indian laborers, and a most disreputable place to do business in." His pleas must have been heard, because later that year the government bought a building near the steamer landing and converted it for use as a customs house. But back to the 49. In December 1865, about 3 weeks after its launch, Captain White took the boat up the river as far as the north end of Lower Arrow Lake, where ice kept him from going farther. Throughout 1866, starting when the ice was out in April, the steamer ran as frequently and quickly as conditions allowed. The southern base was a new town site called Little Dalles, about 25 miles upstream of Fort Colville and 15 miles downstream of the border. The northern terminus was La Porte, at the base of Death Rapids. This was as close as the boat could come to the busiest diggings of the Big Bend area. The total distance of the steamer route was about 250 miles. There was no fixed schedule. Weather and water levels were unpredictable. Depending on the water level, sometimes rapids and canyons had to be navigated by the slow process of winching the boat up on a line. When the water level was too high, a canyon just north of present-day Revelstoke became impassable. The fastest round trip took only 4.5 days. Conditions must have been perfect for that trip. Water level just right so that no lining was required, no contrary winds, weather clear and bright enough to steam through the lakes at night. The slowest trip, made in late June and early July, was about 20 days. 12 of the 20 days were spent waiting for the water level to drop enough to make it through the Revelstoke Canyon. The Revelstoke Museum has on display an artifact from that wait. This blaze, which is quite large, at least 2 feet tall, was found on a cedar tree just downstream from the canyon. Carved in it are the words, "Steamer 49 delayed in consequence of high water, July 4th, 66. The 49 never did get to La Porte on that trip. When they finally attempted to line through the canyon, the capstan pulled right out of the deck. With 3 of her 4 rudders damaged, the 49 returned to Little Dalles. My relatively detailed knowledge of that particular trip comes from the travelogue I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. and from the diary of the colonial official Peter O'Reilly, who happened to take the steamer down to Fort Shepherd on that trip. Like all the river steamers in those days, the 49 was fueled with wood. This photo shows a later steamer, the Nakusp, taking on wood. The amount of wood required to take such a boat upstream on a swift river is phenomenal. The Revelstoke was a sternwheeler that ran between Revelstoke and LaPorte in the early 1900s. It was only a little larger than the 49. One publication states, bucking the current on the 42-mile upstream journey, she burned 42 cords of wood. Riding the river back, 1 cord. The 49's initial run north was slow because they had to stop to cut wood as they went along. This was apparently not a difficult job on the Arrow Lakes, where the shores were reported to be lined with vast piles of dry driftwood. For later trips, they contracted with woodcutters along the way to have wood ready for the steamer. The number of passengers and amount of freight on each trip of the 49 varied. During the year 1866, the Daily British Colonist printed many items about the 49. The first trip was reported to carry 15 tons of freight and 75 passengers. Another had 30 tons of freight and 82 passengers. I wonder where 82 passengers fit onto the boat. Mostly they sat on the floor of the hurricane deck, I suppose. But Spartan conditions were not unique to the 49. For example, one of the earliest steamers in the East Kootenay had no cabin for passengers. A traveler in 1888 wrote, "There was a board roof with canvas hanging at the sides, which afforded some shelter against the rain. The passengers sat shivering round the funnel of the steamer." A slightly later boat in the East Kootenay was described as having neither galley nor cabins, and men slept on the deck while women had a mattress in a curtained-off corner. Not all of the trips of the 49 were crowded. One had 10 passengers, 3 tons of freight, and 3 horses. Another had, and I quote, about 250 sacks of flour, some bacon, some potatoes, and 2 mules, but no passengers. I doubt the amount paid for freight covered the boat's expenses on that last trip. The Big Bend gold rush hasn't made its way into popular knowledge because it was short-lived. Even in 1866, some people were saying the Big Bend was a big bilk. Most of the miners had left by the end of 1867. Prospecting continued through the region, though, resulting in flurries of activity on the Arrow Lakes and the lower Kootenay River. The 49 continued to operate, but 1866 may have been its only profitable year. In 1868, Len White tried to have the 49 registered in BC. He justified it in a letter to the Chief Collector of Customs by saying, "It is a matter of justice to your government, our route being all but 18 miles in BC waters, and the whole business for which our boat runs is in BC." However, the more important reason was financial, as White goes on to say. The requirements of the American marine law are more expensive than the present very depressed state of this country will warrant us in undertaking to pay. We have to pay a very heavy internal revenue tax, a county tax, a territorial tax, a school tax, a road tax, etc., etc., etc. It is positively necessary that we have a relinquishment of expenses. Otherwise, we will have to abandon the trade entirely. John Jane, still the customs officer and constable at Fort Shepherd, issued a temporary registration and wrote to New Westminster for further instructions. The Chief Collector of Customs quickly rejected the registration because the vessel's owners were all Americans residing outside the colony. In spite of White's threat to cease business, the 49 made a few trips that year. Trade did not improve. In July, John Jane wrote to the colonial secretary that trade of every kind is dead in this part of the country. He was collecting so little in fees and duties that his salary, normally paid out of the income, was 4 months in arrears. White became ill with rheumatism and heart trouble the following year, and passed the operation of the 49 to the mate, who was another part owner. White died in Portland, Oregon in 1870 at the age of 43. The 49 operated only sporadically through the 1870s, when nothing was happening in the area to spur non-Indigenous settlement. In 1879, her machinery was removed and the hull left to rot on the bank of the Columbia in the place where she had been built. I'll finish with a brief word about the later history of the West Kootenay. Fort Shepherd was closed in 1870, and as far as I can tell from the sources I've found, the customs post was abandoned then too. The area remained quiet through the 1870s and early 1880s. In 1885, with the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railroad through Revelstoke, things changed. The yellow lines on this map represent railways that were built from 1885 through the 1890s. Steamboats became important links, connecting railheads to other points along the lakes and rivers. With steamboats and railways for transportation of ore, extraction of minerals less valuable than gold became economically viable. There was an influx of settlers. The remaining Sinixt were made unwelcome, and most of them settled south of the border. I grew up not knowing they had ever been there. Permanent settler towns like Trail and Nelson were established, and the West Kootenay took on the character we recognize today. If you have any questions or comments about this presentation, please contact me at the email address given on the screen. For anyone wanting to pursue research on this topic, I can also provide specific references for the documents I've quoted, as well as more general references. To close, here is a list of related books you might enjoy reading.